Being honest, how do we feel about warning signs? It may sound a strange question, but let's face it. We live in a world that quite often totally ignores warning signs. It's true, isn't it? Have you ever had that awful experience of driving down the road and all of a sudden the cars slow down, perhaps they stop. Up ahead of you, you can see the flashing blue light just over the top of the other cars. And then you slowly drive past the scene of an accident. How about all those mangled, tangled remains of automobiles that are unceremoniously just pushed to one side? People gawp at them, don't they? Do you ever stop to think, though? If it does that to the car, what do you think it did to the people inside? All because quite often people just ignore warnings. It says 70 miles an hour, they say I can do 90. They say 30, I can do 50. It says warning, steep bend or whatever. They say, oh, ignore it, I've got a modern car. And all the pain, it's true, isn't it? Yeah, people just totally ignore it. Whenever I think of warnings, now I know I said this the last time I came, but I don't think it sank in with some brothers. Whenever I think of warnings, I think of a place in Wales where there's a huge warning. Do you remember this? There's an island just off the coast, Sully Island. If you ever go there, heed the warning. Because this island, you can only get to it at low water when the causeway to it is exposed. And you know, it's a strange thing. Before you can walk across that causeway, there is a sign, and I tell you, the double doors at the back, the sign is bigger than that. And although the area is run down, they keep that sign in good condition. Bright red. There used to be, I understand they've taken it off now, but there used to be a little piece at the bottom with the number of people who have been drowned and killed on the causeway. But they've taken that off, and I think some thought it was a little macabre. But every year people think they can ignore the warning and they walk across it. But it's strange, I actually saw this take place once. There was a couple coming across that causeway, and the water, it builds up on one side of the causeway, 52 feet the tides in the Bristol Channel. And when it come over the top of there, do you know, it started off that in just seconds, it was that, and then it doesn't matter if you're a young person in your prime, it doesn't matter if you're a bodybuilder, a huge muscular person, it doesn't matter if you're a stunningly attractive young lady, it doesn't matter if you're hyper intelligent, you're stuck on that causeway because you've not heeded the warning. When that water comes over, your dignity goes, you're washed away, and the likelihood is you will die. And yet every year people ignore the warnings. Do you ever stop to think, though, when is it that human beings need a warning? Isn't it when we cannot see a danger? If we could see a danger, we wouldn't need a warning, would we? We are in exactly that situation here tonight. In fact, we're going to speak about a warning that is given in the Bible that hopefully is very, very clear. If anybody is confused about what's said tonight, I'm going to stand up there by those doors, stop me and say I didn't understand, and I'll go through it all again, because I want to leave the room with a clean conscience, because I know full well, unless we heed this warning, we are not going to make it. And the fact that it's a real danger, well, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, it speaks about this as the sin that easily entangles us. Unless we take positive action to avoid it, we're going to be caught out by this sin. Would you like to know what it is? Let's open the book that we always turn to for guidance, God's Word, at Hebrews chapter 3. Now, if you have a marker, put it in Hebrews chapter 3, because we're going to run through a large section of Scripture here, and it is vitally important that we really do get the lesson, the warning. The actual verse, well, that's chapter 3 and verse 12. Let's read it together. And notice how Paul expresses himself here. He states, "Beware, brothers, for fear there should ever develop in any one of you a wicked heart, lacking faith, by drawing away from the living God." Do we see the sin that can easily entangle us? It's a lack of faith. I'll say it again. It's a lack of faith. Now, Paul wrote these words to the Hebrew Christians, but it was such an important lesson. He amplified what he said with a historic lesson, just to amplify to them what the lesson really was, the warning, beware a lack of faith. And we're going to read that in a few moments. But before we start to turn off and think to ourselves, the Bible, what's the relevance of this section of Scripture to me? Just remind ourselves, Paul wrote these words to the Hebrew Christians in 61 CE. Just think. We might be reasoning, well, that's just 9 years to go until the end of their system of things, but they didn't know that. As far as they were concerned, things have been going on as they were at that time for a long time. There would have been ones who would have been reasoning amongst themselves, well, the sign that Jesus gave for the conclusion of our system of things, I've seen that for decades. I've got to go out and earn a living. I've got a career to build. I've got to go out into that world and make a name for myself, to support myself. And they were being distracted away from service to Jehovah God by these things that they felt, well, they were important. They felt that they were more important, though, than kingdom interests. And Paul wrote to them and said, now look, beware a lack of faith. When they read what we're going to read in just a few seconds, it must have made those Hebrew Christians gulp for air. Because the warning example that he gave them about a lack of faith was one that as Hebrew Christians they would have known all about. Let's remind ourselves of it. Let's read 7 through 11. Now remember, it is vitally important that we leave this room tonight understanding what Paul wrote here. Let's look at it. He says, "For this reason, just as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you people listen to his own voice, do not harden your hearts as on the occasion of causing bitter anger, as in the day of making the test in the wilderness, in which your forefathers made a test of me with a trial, and yet they had seen my works for 40 years. For this reason, I became disgusted with this generation, and said, they always go astray in their hearts, and they themselves have not come to know my ways. So I swore in my anger, they shall not enter into my rest." Just words to us. But do we understand why that would have made those Hebrew Christians gulp when they had that read out for the first time? Well, you see, Paul was there quoting directly from the 95th Psalm, verses 7 through 11. Is it any clearer? No? Well, I'll tell you what. We even know that Paul was quoting from the Septuagint version of the Psalms. And we know that because if you look through the account that we've just read there, you will notice there are no place names mentioned, are there? And yet if you go to the 95th Psalm, you will find 2 place names mentioned. But in the Greek Septuagint, they were just translated into common nouns. The names Meribah, which is translated here as quarrelling, and Massah, translated here into testing. Now is it clear why our Hebrew brothers would have gulped at Well, I'll tell you what we need to do then. We need to go back to the original and make sure we understand what he was reading about or speaking about. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 17 and make sure we know what Paul was saying. Exodus chapter 17, so keep your marker there in Hebrews. We'll just scan through these verses because this gives us the historical background as to what Paul was saying. Now, look carefully and we'll understand. In verse 1 of chapter 17, do we see? It just states that the entire assembly of the sons of Israel proceeded to depart from the wilderness of sin by stages. Yes, they were all going out, orderly fashion. Then it says they came to the camp at Rephidim, but look at the last sentence of verse 1. But here's the problem. There was no water for the people to drink. So what did they do? Well, in verse 2, they went quarreling to Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." But Moses said to them, "Why are you quarreling with me?" But please note, why do you keep putting not Moses, but Jehovah to the test? They were quarreling with Moses. Who were they putting to the test? It was Jehovah. If you take a look then in verse 3, they say, "Why is it that you have brought us up out of the land of Egypt, to put us and our sons and our livestock to death by thirst?" Moses cried out to Jehovah, "What shall I do with this people? They're going to stone me." In verse 5, Jehovah gives the remedy. In verse 6, Moses puts it into practice, strikes the rock, the water comes forth, the people have their thirst quenched. But please note the real import, the real lesson in that little account. You see, Jehovah then said to them, "Now you are going to change the name of this place." And he didn't say change the name to "this is the place that Jehovah God gave the Israelites water out of a rock." That wasn't the main point. Look at verse 7. So he called the name of the place, here are those names, Massah and Meribah. Why? Because of the quarreling of the sons of Israel and because of their putting Jehovah to the test, saying, "Is Jehovah in our midst or not?" Do you see the point? Do you see what was going on? What was the warning that Paul used that lesson to teach the Hebrew Christians? Go back to Hebrews chapter 3 and look at verse 8. Are we all there? He said, "Do not harden your hearts as on the occasion that we've just spoken about." So there's the lesson. Now let's reason on it. What do you think the hearts of those Israelites should have been like when they got to Rephidim and they didn't seem to have enough water? You know, this account, the one at Massah and Meribah, that took place about 2 months after the plagues in Egypt. So just think, if you were an Israelite back there at that time, what you had seen in the last 2 months. Let's run over it in our mind. We've seen 10 plagues. How about the first one? The Nile was turned into blood. Would you ever forget that? Would you forget it if just a few weeks ago the local rivers were all turned into stinking, stagnated blood, congealing? Would you forget that? And why has it come about? It's because Jehovah God, our God, is demonstrating his power. Do you know, I draw a very easy lesson for that. That Jehovah is the Almighty God. He's squashing the Egyptian gods. The next plague, well, the frogs. Now the account states that there were so many frogs in that land that when the Israelite and the Egyptian women went to their cooking pots, they took the lids off and they were full of frogs. Pull back the sheets on the bed, full of frogs. Would you sisters ever forget that? Do you like frogs that much that you'd... No. You'd never... And you brothers wouldn't forget it either. Because remember, we're slaves in Egypt. And the account states that when all the frogs died, they had to be piled up into huge mountains. Can you imagine the smell in that warm climate with all those dead frogs? The smell would have filled our nostrils. Why has it come about? Jehovah is just showing his power over the Egyptian gods. The next one, the gnats. Now, I always think that people in Scotland know all about gnats. But these were no ordinary gnats. Gnats on steroids. Super gnats. The account again states that there were so many gnats, it was like a cloud that you couldn't see through. Now, we're there being bitten by those gnats, the same as our Egyptian masters. Would you ever forget that? Can you imagine what it was like to have them all over you? Oh, it must have been awful. Why? Jehovah's prophet, Moses, the one he was using, he brought that about. How about the next one? The gadflies. Now remember, at this point, something tremendous takes place. Because although we were bitten by the gnats, we don't get a nibble from the gadflies. Now these gadflies, they weren't sort of little blue bottles, unpleasant things like that. These were things that bit. If you've been bitten by a horsefly, it does hurt, doesn't it? One little fly like that. Imagine a swarm of them, and you can't escape. But we're all right. Our Egyptian masters, they can't get rid of them. We're very safe, thank you very much. What's this telling us about Jehovah? Can he look after us? I'll say. Imagine having the ability to put into the mind, the thinking process of a fly, the difference between an Egyptian and an Israelite. It's quite something, isn't it? And Jehovah did it. The next one, well then we've got the pestilence that came down on the land and attacked the livestock. But not our livestock. Only the livestock of our Egyptian masters. Then we've got the boils. Oh, have you ever had a boil? I had a boil, one boil in particular. Now, I was about 15, and you're a little self-conscious, aren't you, at 15? I was. And I had one boil on the end of my nose. Her sister Platt had the same boil. Yeah. It was like a throbbing watermelon. But you know, that one boil made the whole of my body ache. Imagine being out in Egypt and seeing your Egyptian masters lying there, covered in huge, pustulating, erupting boils. Would you ever forget that Jehovah made sure that you didn't have any? I'd never forget that. And the next one, well then we've got the hail. And the hail destroys all the crops. Not our crops. Not the ones in Goshen, only the ones of our Egyptian masters. Then we've got the locusts come along. Now the locusts eat everything that is green that is left over after the hail. But not in our land. Not where we are. No locusts come to where we're living. Then we've got the darkness. 3 days of dense black gloom. Now to me, this is the one that must have made the Israelites sit down and think. And really, they must have sat down and thought. Because the work in that land would have really come to nigh on a stop, wouldn't it? Because they had no light. And we're not talking about, a little eclipse for a few minutes. 3 days of dense black gloom. It was so dense that although the Egyptians put up into the corner of their houses their lamps and lit them, it didn't enlighten their houses. We put the one candle up in our house. We've got light everywhere. Is it starting to sink in that Jehovah can care and provide for his people? And if we're loyal, Jehovah will never abandon us. But then the last lesson. Now, imagine you mothers waking up in a land howling with distress because the previous night all of those who didn't follow Moses' direction, they lost all their firstborn. Perhaps we hear it on the grapevine. Have you heard? Even the Pharaoh's son, he's a god, he couldn't have been one of the ones that... He is, yes. And then official channels come... It's true. The Pharaoh's firstborn has died as well. And what does Pharaoh say? Get the people out. And one minute we're slaves, and the next minute we're leaving, and what's happening? We're heaped up with all the treasures. Jehovah says, you get these Egyptians, you ask them for treasure, and they'll give it to you. And they do. Can you imagine what it's like to walk out laden? I'm only taking gold. It's too heavy to carry all the silver. Slaves one minute, millionaires the next. Then we come to the Red Sea, and is Jehovah God going to abandon us? Moses raises that rod, and we see the Red Sea rip apart. I wonder what the noise was like. Could you imagine actually seeing that? I wonder what the noise was like. The account just states there were two congealed walls of water, and the Israelites went through the middle. Now, I don't know about you, but I couldn't have resisted it. I couldn't. I'd have to roll up my sleeve. And I go up to that congealed wall of water, and I wonder what it was like. I wonder what it was like to actually see. Could you see right through it and see the fish swimming about? I don't know. And then we get to the other side, and what does Jehovah do? Pharaoh, the world powers, roaring through, and the waters just wipe them out. We're free. But then we find out we've got no bread. And what does Jehovah God do? He brings bread out of heaven. We don't know what it is. We look at it and we say, what's that? Don't know. Well, we better call it. What's that then? So they did. Called it manna. What's that? I don't know. But you can make bread out of it. And it's not any old bread. The account states that the bread tasted like sweet oiled cakes, the very best. Has Jehovah God let us down in the last 2 months? Have you seen some miraculous things? And then we come to Rephidim, and there's not enough water. Really, what should their hearts have been like? 2 months of seeing all those things, they shouldn't have been saying to themselves, is Jehovah God going to allow us to die of thirst? They should have been saying, now, Jehovah knows we need the water. I wonder how he's going to give it to us. I wonder how Jehovah's going to give us the water. But instead of that, they started to murmur, quarrel, complain, and put God to the test. Really, what was the problem of those Israelites? Look at verse 10. It says, for this reason I became disgusted with this generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts, and they have not come to know my ways. Some people say seeing's believing. Show me a miracle, I'll believe. Well, the Israelites had seen plenty of things, and they still didn't really have faith. Do you know why? They were so distracted by their own physical anxieties, they gave no thought to Jehovah God's purpose. They knew that Jehovah God was there, but they hadn't really come to know him as a real person. They built up no trust in him. They therefore could have no confidence in him. They therefore lacked faith in him. What wicked people. They just took him for granted. They treated Jehovah God as if he was some kind of a supermarket, really, didn't they? They said, we'll worship you as long as you give us what we want, when we want it, at a price that we're willing to pay. Any difficulties coming to us, and we're off. Now, do you want us to worship you or not? And that's what they were like with Jehovah God. They lacked faith in God's promise to care for them. He said he would. 2 months they'd seen all that. He hadn't let them down once. And now they missed out because of a glass of water. Tells us something, doesn't it? Now Paul took that and applied it to the Christians. In fact, in verse 11, should we just go back to that one? Because of that lack of faith, he said, they shall not enter into my rest. And they didn't. Now 12 and 13 we're instructed to read again, just to make sure we understand what Paul was doing with this information. He said, beware, brothers, for fear there should ever develop in any one of you a wicked heart lacking faith, by drawing away from the living God. But keep on exhorting one another each day, as long as it may be called today, for fear any one of you should become hardened, note, by the deceptive power of sin. So there's the lesson. He applied it to those Israelites, but we're also applying it directly today to us. Don't harden the heart. And did we see how we can do that? In verse 13, did we see it spoke about the deceptive power of sin? Would you like to know if your heart is being hardened by the deceptive power of sin? Because we're going to take the principle and apply it now. How about this? When Jehovah tells us to do something through the slave class, do we take it on board? Or do we think it's wrong? If we don't do it, we either think it's wrong and we've got a hard, wicked heart, or on the other hand, we lack faith that this really is Jehovah's channel of communication. Take our pick. Either one takes us to destruction. Do we get that? If Jehovah tells us to do something via the slave class, we should do it. Because if we start quarrelling and murmuring against the slave class, who are we putting to the test? You got it, haven't you? It's Jehovah. This channel has brought us to the point whereby we can almost take a deep breath and suck air in from the new system. Do you think it's going to mislead us now? Or are we going to do what it says? For instance, how about with regards to, and we're just applying the principle there in a number of different areas, and I apply it in the same way in every congregation. But how about with regards to dress? Now obviously we're speaking now with regards to our sisters, but it's just a very interesting way of applying the principle. You see, you look at the different standards concerning dress, and there is a huge gulf between Jehovah's people and that corrupt and perverted world out there. It's true, isn't it? You look at some women in the world, it looks as if they've been poured into their clothes and forgot to say when. But that's not the case for us. Let me just clarify what the standard is. If a sister is wearing a dress that is so short that it becomes revealing, it is inappropriate for Christians. If a sister is wearing a dress that is so tight that it becomes revealing, it is inappropriate for Christians. If a sister wears a dress or skirt that could be touching the shoes and yet has a split in it so that it becomes revealing, it is inappropriate for Christians. If a sister wears a blouse that is so low cut that it is revealing. Do we get the point? I'm not saying measurements. I'm just saying when it becomes revealing, it is inappropriate for Christians. I cannot but marvel at that world's ability to do certain things. Have you seen the material that you can actually see through? Have you seen that material? What do they call it? Anybody? I don't have a clue. But I tell you, you know the glass in the doors, that's transparent. You can see straight through it. Now the brick wall there, that's opaque. You cannot see through it. But in between, there's something else called translucent. Now you can't see clearly through it, but it gives you a good idea as to what's underneath. Don't you marvel at Satan's ability to make a material that's fashionable, that's designed really to titillate with regards to what's underneath? It's inappropriate for Christians. It's not modest. If you want to know what Jehovah's standard is with regards to sister's dress, take a look in the magazines, look at the videos, and you'll see it. I had the awful experience on one occasion of having a sister turn up at a circuit assembly and having to say to her, you cannot go on the platform dressed like that. She'd all prepared herself. You can't go on. What you're wearing is not appropriate. Some congregations have got themselves into the foolish state of having a table made for the sisters with a modesty board on the back. If someone's wearing something that's immodest, they don't go on the platform. Now, at this point, can I just pull in the two aspects of the principle that we've been speaking about? Do we say, come on, no one's telling me what to wear? hard heart, unreceptive to counsel? Or do we say, what do these old men in Brooklyn know about dress? They haven't got a clue what they're talking about. Lack of faith that this is Jehovah's channel directing us. What are we going to do? You see, sometimes our deceptive heart starts to create rationale, so that what is definitely wrong, we think about it because we want to do it, until in the end it seems right. And some sisters at this point say, do you know it's all the shops sell? If it is all the shops sell, we're not going to wear anything that the shops sell. We'll make our own. We are not going to allow that world to dictate to us what we wear in the congregation. Do you get the point? Do we really believe it? Are they misleading us? Are we hardening our hearts? There's the principle. And we can apply it right across the board in our lives as Christians. How about with regards to music, for instance? Now, the slave class have given us plenty of information with regards to certain types of music that are clearly inappropriate for Christians. And we would never listen to them. Now, I know the district overseer brought this out. David Algar brought this out. But, do you know, sadly, you get some brothers who apply to go to Bethel, and on the form there it says, do you ever listen to rap music, heavy metal music? And it goes through some of the categories I've never heard of, to be honest. I don't know what they are. But if you say yes, you don't go. You're not viewed as spiritual. And when you do get little snippets of this information before you can get to the button on the radio to turn it off, you understand why. Because it's disgusting. And yet some say, I'm not hurting anyone else. It's only a personal hi-fi. But Jehovah says it's wrong. Now, do we believe that this counsel is for our benefit? Or do we harden our heart? Do we think this is the channel that Jehovah's using? Or do we have faith in it? We can take our pick, but if we listen to that music, we are isolating ourselves from Jehovah. We're quarreling not with the slave class, but with him. Do you see the point? I think also about a problem that we have in our circuit to do with nightclubs. Now, we mentioned this again on Sunday. Look, let me just explain to all those who go to nightclubs. Personally, you can do whatever you like. But Jehovah has said, if you like to go to nightclubs, and you do go to them, you're pulling away from Jehovah's standards. It's clear, isn't it? The slave class have made it. I mean, there are people who go to these nightclubs who are sexual predators. And they're experts at dragging Jehovah's people down to the level of that world out there. Now, we've had the warning. If we don't accept it, we've either got a hard heart and no one's selling us anything, or we lack faith that this is Jehovah's channel of communication. At this point, we're to clarify something that evidently causes a great deal of confusion amongst some. You see, sometimes you listen to brothers, and they know full well that what they're doing is wrong, and they say, oh, I'm just drifting a bit. I'm just drifting away. Have you ever heard that? Do you remember the watchtower we had about drifting? And there was that lovely illustration, I'll never forget it, because I like the sea. And there was someone in a boat, and they just dropped off to sleep, and they were drifting into dangerous rocky waters. Do you remember that, yeah? Yeah. Take a look at chapter 2 and verse 1, and we'll see a familiar phrase. Hebrews chapter 2, and look at verse 1, remember? It just says, that is why it is necessary for us to pay more than the usual attention to the things heard by us, that we may never, there it is, drift away. Now keep that in mind, and let's go back to the account that we're speaking about, chapter 3, and we'll reread verse 12. Look out for the difference. It says, beware, brothers, for fear there should ever develop in any one of you a wicked heart lacking faith by... There's no mention of drifting. Did you get it? He said drawing away. Do you know the difference between a drift and a draw? Drifting away is something you do when you are totally unconscious. Drawing away is something you do consciously. Let's not fool ourselves. If we know what Jehovah God's standard is, and even if we push it to the back of our minds, and then we make the conscious decision not to do it, we're not drifting. We are actively drawing away from the living God. Do you see the point? There's a massive difference, and some have been fooling themselves. So there's the clarification. Sadly, some have got themselves at this time into such a state because of drawing away. You see, the first time you do something that you know is wrong, you get that little voice inside, don't you? The conscience, don't do it. And you say, be quiet. And the conscience says, don't do it. And you say, I'm ignoring you. And you go and do it. Second time, how loud is the voice? Louder or quieter? It's quieter, isn't it? And it gets quieter and quieter and quieter. I know a brother who's a chef. It's my father-in-law. And he can go into an oven, open up the oven door, pick out a red-hot meat tray, red hot, and just pick it up with his bare hands and just put it on the side of the... and just carry on the conversation as if he does it all the time. Well, he does. You look at that man's hands, though. He's got calluses on them, about 1/4 of an inch thick, like leather. The first time he ever picked anything hot up, it burned. But because he kept doing it, he built up those calluses, and now he is completely desensitized. The same thing happens with the figurative heart. If we ignore our conscience once and keep ignoring it, it dies. We become so desensitized to what is right and wrong. Do we get the point? In the end, we just totally ignore it. Then we are in real danger. And the end result of having a hard heart, of lacking faith, of becoming desensitized, death. We will not be allowed to enter into Jehovah's rest either. Now there's the big problem. Now what are we going to do about it? Well, Paul just doesn't say you lot are all going to die out there. He didn't say that to the Hebrew Christians, does he? What he says is there's a way out. Let's read on to find out what it is. Verse 14, this is what we must do to avoid the fatal outcome of a lack of faith. He said, for we actually become partakers of the Christ only, and please note, he said only, if we make fast our hold on the confidence we had at the beginning firm to the end. Do we remember the confidence we had at the beginning? Do we remember that? When all of a sudden the truth became a truth to us. It was real. You know that time when previously you just asked questions, and you probably had a little study with someone, because they're lovely people, these Jehovah's Witnesses. I like them. Nice and pleasant. They don't do anybody harm. I just have them in for a cup of tea, a little chat. And then you start to have your questions answered. And you think, well, wait a minute. I better think of deeper questions. And you think of something, you think, I'm going to get them now. And you look forward to them coming back, so you can put them on the spot and prove they're wrong. But when they keep answering your questions, all of a sudden, you realize, hey, it's true. And what do you feel like at that moment when you suddenly speak in your prayers to Jehovah God, and you realize there is someone actually listening to you, and you pray for something to happen, and it happens. You have to put your effort in, but it happens. How do you feel? Could you walk on water? Your confidence is so high because you know it's true. Well, it says there that we've got to keep that right until the end. How can we do it? Well, how do we get the confidence in the first place? Bible study. Do you think we can keep this confidence if we don't study the Bible? You know, sometimes we fail to understand that those Jews back there actually were eyewitnesses of miraculous things, but they didn't allow it to build up in them a confidence, a relationship with Jehovah, which led to faith. Now, we've got it recorded in that book. Are we students of it so that we build up this trust and confidence in Jehovah? Are we? It's not going to come automatically, is it? You don't go down to the shop and buy faith. You have to dig deep. And when you do, you can get it. If we neglect our personal Bible study, we are going to fail. How about another thing that we can do to maintain our confidence firm to the end? Consciences. Never ignore the conscience. Now, it could well be that some are sitting here now and they know that their conscience has been strangled by their refusal to listen to it. Well, do something about it quickly, because we are running out of time. We train our conscience again via Bible study, by meditation. We think about what the slave class is saying, and we make ourselves do it. And after a while, we suddenly realize that it was the best thing to do. Who's benefited? We have. We start to develop a trust in it then, and a confidence, and that leads to faith. Do we see the cycle? If we break it, we're not going to make it. How about also our prayer to Jehovah God? You see, sometimes we just get into that routine of making the last prayer of the day the main one. You know the prayer we're talking about, the one you fall asleep in? Yeah, it's true. It's so easy to wait until the end of the day and just drift off. Have you ever had that awful experience? You're not sure if you said amen at the end. I can't be the only one. Sister Richard's the same as me. Do you think you could develop a relationship with someone that you kept falling asleep with whenever you were speaking to them? Why don't we think about praying midday when we're wide awake and alert? Why not put a time aside to speak to Jehovah? Now, we're all busy, but this must be the most important priority in our life. So let's do it. We think also about other things. Well, you know, the Israelites, they were so overtaken by their own immediate physical needs that they forgot Jehovah's purpose. Do you know, the same can happen to us? Satan's putting the pressure on everybody. He's making earning a living so difficult that to some, they're so engrossed in it that Jehovah just is something that they tack in at the end of the week. Don't allow Satan to squeeze us into that world's mold. What is the number one priority? Is this going to exist forever, this world? Take a look down the shops. They're the shops that are soon going to be completely wiped away. Are we going to be here to see it? Yes, we have to supply things for our family, material things. But if that is number one priority, we've got to change quickly. Jehovah said if we serve him whole-souled, he will guarantee what we need to survive. Now, do we believe it? Are we going to give him what he deserves? Do we really think he will provide for us? Only we can answer that. But you see, if we don't, it's a lack of faith. He said he would. Now, sometimes, you know, you look at these different applications of the principle, and some brothers say things like, well, do you think that Jehovah is going to stop one of his loyal sisters going into the new world because of an inch of material on the bottom of a skirt? Do you think he's going to stop one of our young brothers or sisters going into that new world because of listening to a type of music? No one else is listening to it. Do you think Jehovah is going to stop a father, a family head going into the new world because they're providing for their family a very high standard of living? The Israelites lost out for a glass of water. A glass of water. We could lose out for an inch of material, a CD, high standard of living. It's up to us. We've got to keep in tune with Jehovah's organization and do what he tells us to do. He has given us a commission to take out the message to this neighborhood. It's our commission, it's our assignment. Are we 100% supportive of it? If so, we're demonstrating we've got faith. And of course we should never forget the little phrase used there in verse 13. Do you see at the beginning of that verse? He just says, but keep on exhorting one another each day as long as it may be called today. Now how do we do that? We come to our meetings, don't we? Do you know, I think that your congregation has greater potential than any other we've seen in the circuit. And do you know why? It's because your average meeting attendance on Sunday is about 70, I think it's 72. Tonight here, again, 93. Now, I don't know who it is that doesn't come. But I do know that Jehovah God wants us to be here. We've got the command in the Bible. I know it's hard at times. But have we got faith that when Jehovah God says, get to the meetings, it's a priority in our lives when we get here? Or have we not got faith that this is the place to be certain nights of the week? You see, we've looked at these things, and no doubt we've thought of, well, you know, I'm going to have to either improve or just fail. Well, if we have, don't forget the Israelites, or those Hebrew Christians rather, were in exactly the same situation. And Paul didn't go and batter them down. In conclusion, let's just read one more verse, and please look out for a date from which we can serve Jehovah whole-souled and demonstrate that we've got the faith that's necessary. It's mentioned in verse 15. It says, today, if you people listen to his own voice, do not harden your hearts, as on the occasion of causing bitter anger. We can demonstrate we've got the necessary faith, and we're not hardening our hearts if we do these necessary things from, did you see the date? Today. Brothers, beware a lack of faith, and never forget that it's someone who cares for us who puts up a warning sign when there's real danger ahead. Well, that concludes